Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into one of those fundamental questions that every human being has probably pondered at some point. What happens when we die?
It really is a query as old as consciousness itself, isn't it? You see it reflected everywhere, from ancient myths all the way to modern scientific inquiry.
Exactly. And while countless stories and beliefs surround this question, we're narrowing our focus today. We're looking at a specific kind of experience, near-death experiences, or NDEs.
And even more specifically, the evidential ones.
Right. This isn't just about sharing intriguing personal accounts, though many NDEs are certainly moving.
No, this particular deep dive takes us right into the heart of a pretty rigorous academic debate. It actually unfolded publicly across multiple issues of a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Near-Death Studies.
And that's a serious venue, right? Where scholars bring focused inquiry to these, well, extraordinary claims, treating them as a phenomenon to be understood, maybe even explained.
Absolutely. It's not fringe stuff in that context. It's treated academically.
And the central conflict we're exploring today involves a challenge. It was posed by a skeptical philosopher, Keith Augustine, who actually specializes in NDE research.
Yeah, he engaged directly with NDE scholars. He was questioning whether the existing accounts, even the ones that seemed really strong, could genuinely provide corroborating evidence.
Evidence that human consciousness, that sense of you, can function independently of the physical body and brain.
Augustine's position, and he referenced others like Michael Potts who agreed, was essentially a direct challenge. It was like, okay, if you claim NDEs show consciousness surviving brain function, show us the proof.
Give us the goods.
Basically, yes. Provide specific, verifiable details from these experiences that could only have been perceived if consciousness was operating outside the normal physical senses, especially when the brain is, well, demonstrably not functioning as usual.
So our mission in this deep dive is pretty clear. We're going to unpack that skeptical challenge in detail, lay out Augustine's specific arguments,
and then, crucially, examine the extensive body of specific, documented, and evidential cases that the NDE scholars brought forward in their response.
And the big question for us, for you listening, is, can these particular cases, these corroborated reports that seem to match the skeptic's own criteria, can they actually stand up to scrutiny?
And maybe suggest something profound about consciousness, its relationship to the brain, and perhaps even, the possibility of survival after death.
We're going to navigate this intellectual landscape with a focus on the academic rigor presented in these sources, but, blend it with that essential curiosity that makes exploring the unknown so fascinating.
Get ready for some surprising, well-documented facts drawn directly from the research. We're glad you're joining us for this exploration.
Okay, let's start by really digging into that skeptical challenge. What exactly were critics like Keith Augustine asking for? You said he specializes in NDEs, so he wasn't just dismissing them outright?
No, not at all. He engaged with the material seriously. But he was definitely questioning the evidential weight of many popular NDE reports, particularly those often cited as proof that consciousness can operate separately from the brain.
What were his core arguments then?
Well, they were really rooted in the idea that NDEs, however vivid they might feel, are ultimately products of, or at least dependent on, the physical brain.
So generated internally.
Exactly. He questioned the validity of several really prominent cases often put forward by proponents, like Kimberly Clark Sharp's famous story about seeing a tennis shoe on a hospital roof.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one.
And the detailed reports from Pam Reynolds during her complex standstill brain surgery. Even NDE accounts from individuals who are clinically blind. He basically argued that these cases, when you examine them really closely, didn't hold up as definitive proof of consciousness operating outside the brain.
What else? Did he have other lines of argument?
He did. He also focused on instances he categorized as false perceptions within some NDEs.
False perceptions? What does that mean in this context?
He cited cases where NDErs reported seeing things or interacting with people that didn't actually align with physical reality. So, discrepancies with the actual environment they were supposedly observing.
Like getting details wrong.
Sometimes, yeah. Or encounters with living individuals who later said, no, that interaction never happened. Or even seeing imagery involving mythological figures or characters from fiction.
Okay, I can see how that would raise red flags.
His argument was that these elements look much more like typical hallucinations, which we clearly understand as phenomena generated by the brain.
Right, not external perceptions.
But he also pointed to other common features of NDEs, things he called psychophysiological correlates, basically. the measurable physical changes in the body during the NDE state.
Like heart rate changes, brain activity patterns, that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly. And also cultural correlates, how the specific imagery or the narrative of the NDE might reflect the person's cultural or religious background.
Ah, so if someone sees figures from their own religion, that might be seen as culturally influenced rather than objectively real.
Precisely. He suggested these features indicate that the NDE experience and its imagery are solely products of the individual's mind operating within the confines of the brain, not genuine perceptions of some independent reality or location.
So his conclusion was pretty stark then.
It was. NDEs occur within and are entirely dependent on the human brain. That was his bottom line.
But here's where the debate gets really specific and interesting, isn't it? Augustine, and you mentioned Michael Potts joined him in these arguments, they didn't just criticize the existing evidence, they actually spelled out what kind of evidence would impress them.
Yes, exactly. They set a high bar. They essentially said, okay, if you can show us this specific kind of thing, well, that might genuinely suggest consciousness can function outside the brain, maybe even hint at an afterlife.
What were those specific criteria? What did they demand?
They detailed very specific, verifiable criteria. They wanted reports that included accurate details about the specific clothing worn by healthcare personnel during, say, a resuscitation attempt.
Like not just a doctor, but the doctor with the red tie.
Something verifiable like that, yes. They also asked for precise reporting of the sequence of events that unfolded during these critical medical moments. Not just vague impressions, but the order things happened in.
Okay, sequence of events. What else?
And they demanded details observed in the emergency room or the surgical suite that could only have been known by someone physically present and consciously aware of the environment. Things a non-functional or, hallucinating brain shouldn't be able to perceive accurately.
Details you couldn't just guess or overhear vaguely.
Exactly. And the critical twist, the part that really threw down the gauntlet, was Augustine's assertion. He concluded that evidence of this specific sort, the kind he and Potts outlined as potentially impressive,
Let me guess.
has yet to happen.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So the challenge was, this is what would convince us, but it doesn't exist.
Precisely. And it's worth noting, he wasn't alone in setting this kind of standard. Susan Blackmore, a well-known naturalistic psychologist studying consciousness.
Right, I know her work.
She'd also repeatedly stated that documented evidential NDE cases, particularly ones from blind individuals or those involving verifiable perceptions at a distance, could potentially overturn her naturalistic explanation if strong, verifiable examples were produced.
So the challenge was clearly articulated by the skeptical side.
Absolutely. And the NDE scholars, in their extensive response in the journal Near-Death Studies, took this challenge head-on. They presented numerous detailed cases they argued met these exact criteria.
Their core counterargument being
That Augustine and Potts were in fact clearly mistaken in their assertion that such details were non-existent. They basically said the evidence does exist. Maybe the critics just weren't looking in the right places or perhaps were predisposed to disbelieve it when they found it.
All right, so the gauntlet was thrown. Show us specific, verifiable details perceived during the NDE that couldn't have been known through normal means, especially when the brain wasn't functioning. Details like clothing, sequence of events, or ER specifics. Let's dive into the scholar's detailed response now, starting with the kind of evidential cases found within the room where the patient was located during their medical crisis.
Okay. A common point raised by critics relates to these prospective studies designed to capture exactly this kind of evidence. Where researchers place random visual targets, like numbers or symbols, high overhead in hospital rooms where cardiac arrests are likely.
Right, hoping someone having an NDE might see them from above.
Exactly. And skeptics correctly point out that no full identifications of these specific random targets have occurred in those particular formal studies yet.
Okay, that sounds like a point for the skeptics then.
Well, yes and no. While that's true for those specific studies looking for random targets, the scholars immediately countered by presenting numerous corroborated cases where NDErs did accurately identify numbers or objects placed overhead.
So not the random targets in the studies, but similar observations in other documented cases.
Precisely. Demonstrating that the ability to perceive external reality from that claimed elevated vantage point has been documented. They cited instances like the successful identification and repetition of a random 12-digit numeral printed on the top of an overhead medical device, confirmed by a nurse who was present.
12 digits, that's incredibly specific.
It is. There are other cases too, like the correct identification of a 4-figure number, And several accounts where smaller numbers were seen, but only from a perspective looking down from above the body.
So the angle of observation was key.
It seems so in those cases. Another involves a five-figure number accurately identified. Again, these aren't from the formal prospective studies, but they are documented cases where NDErs accurately perceived and later reported information located in positions only viewable from overhead.
And was it just numbers?
No, it wasn't limited to numbers. They also documented the correct identification of unlikely or, unusual objects visible only from the ceiling.
Why might NDErs not focus on the random targets in the studies then?
Well, one explanation the scholars offered is that attention during the, frankly, overwhelming NDE state is naturally drawn to the more unique, emotionally resonant, or striking aspects of the experience, not necessarily mundane targets put there for an experiment.
Makes sense. You're having this profound experience. You might not be looking for a random number on the ceiling.
Exactly. But these confirmed cases, seeing things like specific numbers or objects visible only from an elevated perspective, they argue demonstrate the capacity to perceive external reality from that claimed vantage point, regardless of what the target was.
Okay, so that addresses the general idea of overhead perception. What about the direct response to Augustine's specific demands? Clothing, sequences, ER details.
Right. The scholars argued forcefully, citing case after case, that his claim that these details were non-existent was, as they put it, clearly mistaken. They imply the evidence is there if you're willing to look and accept it.
So let's examine those specific examples that directly address Augustine's criteria. First, emergency room clothing details. What did they present?
One documented case involved Joyce Harmon, an ICU nurse. It was her very first day back at work after a vacation, and she was part of a team resuscitating a patient she'd never met before.
Okay.
The very next day, the resuscitated patient saw Harmon and, apparently completely out of the blue, said, "Oh, you're the one with the plaid shoelaces."
Plaid shoelaces, that's oddly specific.
Isn't it? The patient then explained she'd observed Harmon's shoes while watching the resuscitation attempt from overhead.
And the significance.
Well, Harmon had just bought those specific plaid shoelaces while on vacation and was wearing them for the very first time that day. During a chaotic life-or-death resuscitation, details about an unknown nurse's brand-new specific shoelaces. It's highly unlikely to be something discussed, easily overheard, or even consciously noticed by someone in distress, right?
Especially not the patient themselves.
Exactly. The patient's ability to recall this specific novel detail, seen only from a downward angle onto shoes during a crisis, is presented as striking evidence by the scholars.
Okay, that's one example. Are there others like it?
Yes. There's another case involving a nurse practitioner who rushed to assist a patient in cardiac arrest. Days later, the revived patient introduced herself and explained that during the resuscitation, she'd witnessed the process from above her body.
And she describes something specific.
She provided an intricate description of a specific, rather unusual object worn on the nurse practitioner's clothing. The nurse practitioner was reportedly stunned.
Why? Just the accuracy.
Not only the accuracy and detail, but also because the object had been borrowed the previous day and was already returned. So it wasn't even something the nurse wore regularly.
Wow. So the patient described a temporary, unique item accurately, perceived during cardiac arrest. That does seem hard to explain through normal means.
That's the argument the scholars make.
Okay, so that covers clothing details. What about Augustine's request for the precise sequence of events during resuscitation?
Numerous examples are provided here too, but one of the most detailed and, frankly, compelling was documented by an emergency room pediatrician, Melvin Morse.
Morse, okay. What was the case?
He shared the case of Crystal Merzlock, a young girl who suffered profound brain injury from nearly drowning. Medically, it was documented she had no pulse for at least 17 minutes.
17 minutes, that's a very long time.
Extremely long. She lacked a gag reflex, had fixed and dilated pupils conditions. Morse noted indicated her upper brain was likely non-functional. She was profoundly comatose.
What happened next?
3 days later, against all odds, Crystal woke up and recovered. About 3 weeks later, she shared her experience. It took nearly an hour for her to recount the precise sequence of events she had observed while comatose in the emergency room.
An hour's worth of detail from a comatose state.
Exactly. She knew a tall physician without a beard entered the room first, followed by Morse himself, who was shorter and had a beard and was her primary doctor. She recounted being taken to a larger room initially, then moved to a smaller one for x-rays. She even knew she had been intubated through her nose.
Which is less common, you said.
Yes, less common than oral intubation. Think about that. Crystal was unconscious, eyes closed on a ventilator for 3 days. Even if you try to argue, she somehow overheard snippets of sound.
How could she perceive heights, beards, room changes, the specific intubation method?
It seems to require more than just hearing, doesn't it? It implies visual perception and a clear chronological processing of events over an extended period, far beyond what a severely brain-injured, comatose patient should be capable of.
What did Morse think?
He stated, this experience fundamentally changed his life and his perspective on consciousness.
I can imagine. Were there other sequential cases?
Morse documented others, yes,
Yeah.
including an 8-year-old girl who drowned and received CPR for over 45 minutes from parents, EMTs, ER physicians before her heart restarted. She later recalled the entire extended resuscitation process in detail.
45 minutes of recall. Incredible.
And another sequential case involved a woman with a documented 4-minute cardiac arrest. She reported being above her body and described the resuscitation proceedings in the ambulance. The paramedic crew members verified her account.
They confirmed she accurately recalled observations.
Yes, several corroborated observations that occurred precisely during her cardiac arrest.
Yeah.
And that period, cardiac arrest, is critical.
Why specifically?
Because we know medically it initiates a very rapid shutdown of brain activity. Upper brain activity is gone in seconds, lower brain activity shortly after. So verified NDE data from this specific time frame is exceptionally crucial for challenging the idea that consciousness is solely dependent on the central nervous system.
Okay, so clothing sequences. What about the third category Augustine and Potts asked for? Descriptions of other ER details known only by being present.
Again, the scholars provided numerous examples. One involved a young patient who suffered a cardiac arrest. During the resuscitation, from his perspective above his body, he noticed a medical machine problem.
What kind of problem?
He reported that the machine was unplugged. A nurse checked and confirmed the patient was correct.
So he noticed something the medical staff hadn't.
Apparently so. Another striking case involved a patient under general anesthesia. She claimed she observed the situation from the ceiling.
What did she report seeing?
She reported being able to watch another surgery happening in the next room. She described a leg amputation and seeing the severed leg being placed in a yellow bag.
Could she have possibly seen that normally?
The attending surgeon confirmed the amputation was true, but stated that this observation was not possible naturally from the patient's physical location under anesthesia.
Wow. Okay. Any others?
Cardiologist Michael Sabom documented 10 specific cases from cardiac patients, some with no measurable heartbeat. They detailed things like furniture layout, specific instruments, dial readings on machines, even uncommon medical practices.
And his conclusion?
He concluded that several of the verified observations could only have been observed visually, often from an elevated perspective. Simple overhearing wasn't enough to explain them.
And Bruce Grayson, another major researcher, you mentioned him.
Yes, he shared a case he personally investigated involving a patient during open-heart surgery. The patient later described watching from above his body. He noted something peculiar.
What was it?
He said that while his chest was open, his surgeon was flapping his arms as if trying to fly.
Flapping his arms during surgery.
Sounds strange, right? But when Grayson interviewed the surgeon chuckled and explained his specific, rather unusual habit. To maintain sterility after washing or at other times, he placed his hands against his chest and point using his elbows.
Ah, creating that flapping appearance.
Exactly. And a cardiologist present at the time confirmed the patient accurately reported these details very soon after regaining consciousness.
The speed of reporting seems important there, too.
It does. It supports the idea of perception during the event, not constructed later.
So the scholars argue these kinds of cases, with accurate descriptions of specific, often mundane details within the immediate environment, confirmed by others present, are?
Hardly rare. That's the phrase they use. They cite Nancy Evans Bush's compilation, which was meticulously analyzed by Jan Holden. It listed 107 specific, evidenced NDE cases reported by various authors.
And the main category was?
Descriptions of the immediate surroundings, and importantly, many were confirmed by outside sources.
Holden analyzed these rigorously.
Extremely. She ranked them by the strength of external corroboration. Even with strict criteria, she documented 107 such reports. And many were collected by major researchers in the field: Ken Ring, Madeleine Lawrence, Evelyn Valerino, Emily Cook, Ian Stevenson, Grayson, the Fenwicks, Morse.
So adding in other documented cases, the total number of corroborated reports from the immediate vicinity is?
Well over 150, according to the scholar's assessment.
Which brings us back to that critical medical context. Cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation. Remind us why that's so key.
Because medical research confirms it leads to measurable elimination of upper brain activity in mere seconds. Lower brain activity ceases shortly after. Verified NDE data occurring within this time frame is profoundly important.
Because it directly challenges the idea that consciousness absolutely requires a functioning central nervous system.
Exactly. And the scholars emphasize that literally dozens of cases with corroboration inside the room have been documented during exactly this state of cardiac arrest.
It really is an incredible number of detailed, later verified observations, reportedly happening precisely when measurable heart and brain activity was shown to be absent.
It's a major argument for the persistence of consciousness, from their perspective. They argue that the sheer unlikelihood of attributing every single one of these dozens of different situations, precise timings, specific mundane details, sequential events to mistakenness, or deceit, or coincidence. It borders on credulity when you look at the cumulative evidence.
So the scholars contend that these specific examples directly address and demonstrate the existence of the precise evidential requirements Potts and Augustine laid out from within the room.
Yes, details reported during medical emergencies, often confirmed by one or more people present, and that consistent testimony from patients claiming an above-the-body vantage point.
Coupled with the fact that many corroborated details were only visible from that elevated angle.
It adds further weight to their claims, according to the scholars. Far from being non-existent, they presented over 150 documented, corroborated cases from the immediate vicinity alone.
But the evidence doesn't stop there, does it? It extends beyond the room.
Indeed. While Augustine and Potts focused on within-the-room details, other prominent skeptics, like Susan Blackmore, expressed a preference for evidence from a distance.
Why from a distance?
As a way to more definitively rule out any potential normal sensory input, however minimal, from the immediate environment. She also specifically challenged proponents to provide accurate NDE testimony from individuals who are clinically sightless.
Did Blackmore find any such cases herself?
She noted her initial inability to find convincing examples of verified distant perception, while acknowledging that such cases, if verified, could indeed be strong evidence against her naturalistic thesis.
So the NDE scholars then presented cases they argued involved distance perception.
Exactly. One of the earliest and most widely discussed is Kimberly Clark Sharp's account of seeing a tennis shoe on a hospital roof during her NDE.
Right, the famous tennis shoe case. You mentioned it was controversial.
It has faced some challenges over the years regarding verification details, but the scholars note that subsequent research has reportedly buttressed her account. Even Blackmore, while having difficulty getting further independent verification, initially saw it as potentially strong evidence if definitively corroborated.
Are there other similar cases?
Yes, other less widely known cases. Kenneth Ring and Madeleine Lawrence reported a case from Hartford, Connecticut, also involving a shoe on a hospital roof.
Another shoe on a roof.
A red shoe in this case. A resuscitated patient claimed to have floated through hospital floors to the roof, observed the Hartford skyline, and then noticed this red shoe below.
Was it verified?
Reportedly verified later by a hospital resident and a janitor. And the scholars highlight that this case happened before Sharp's story became widely known to the nurse who reported it.
Making it less likely to be a copycat story.
That's the suggestion.
What about Crystal Merslock, the girl who nearly drowned? Did her perceptions extend beyond the ER?
They did. Beyond the detailed ER account we discussed, while still unconscious and hospitalized, she reported seeing her family at home, a significant distance away.
And she gave details.
Very specific details. The exact location of each family member, what they were doing, even details about their clothing, like her mother cooking roast chicken and rice.
And was this confirmed?
Remarkably, all these particulars were reportedly confirmed by her family soon after Crystal revived.
That's quite something. Are there cases involving even greater distances?
Yes, some are truly astonishing. Consider Tony's case. This happened during complex open-heart surgery in Milwaukee. He had a documented heart and respiratory arrest lasting 30 minutes.
30 minutes. Okay. What did he report?
He reported seeing his wife in the hospital waiting room and simultaneously seeing his home in Florida over 1,200 miles away.
Florida, from Milwaukee, during cardiac arrest.
That's the report. He provided specific, out-of-the-ordinary details and the sequence of events he claimed to have observed in both locations.
And the verification?
Reportedly confirmed by his wife, their house sitter in Florida, and even investigated by another physician. This case involves a double arrest, multiple distant sightings, and multiple forms of verification. The scholars present it as particularly powerful.
Are there many other distance cases documented?
The scholars cite other instances. NDErs reporting observations approximately 20 and 30 miles away, with details subsequently confirmed by interviewers. They note researchers like Grayson, Kelly, and Kelly found 60 people in their study who reported awareness of events outside the range of their physical senses.
And many researchers have confirmed these.
Yes, they report many distance cases have been researched and confirmed by various established researchers: Van Lommel, Sartori, Badham, the Fenwicks, Cook, Stevenson, Long, Morse, Sabam, Ford. Quite a list.
And critically, did these distance cases also occur during periods of, say, cardiac arrest?
That's a crucial point they underscore. Many of these distance cases also reportedly occurred in the absence of measurable heart or brain activity, including numerous strong cardiac arrest scenarios.
So the argument is the same as for the within-the-room cases.
Essentially, yes. The scholars argue it becomes exceedingly unlikely that every single one of these dozens of cases where there was neither apparent heart nor brain activity can be convincingly explained away by claiming the data was learned through other means, misperceived, fabricated, or was just coincidence, especially when the events occurred precisely during the medical crisis period.
How many distance cases are we talking about in total based on these sources?
Based on the sources cited, these accounts alone add up to more than 110 evidenced NDEs reported as taking place a distance away from the experiencer's physical body.
Over 110. That's a significant number.
The scholars contend this cumulative testimony must be viewed as among the most convincing corroborated reports challenging purely physical explanations. They suggest attempts to dismiss this wide variety of observed scenarios, particularly those compound cases with multiple layers of evidence, often reveal more about a pre-existing worldview bias than a successful refutation of the data itself.
Okay, so we've covered evidence from within the room and from a distance. What other categories of evidential NDEs did the scholars present?
Another significant category concerns reports where the NDEr met previously deceased persons whose deaths were unknown to the NDEr until that encounter during the NDE.
Meeting the dead. Bruce Grayson described different types of these.
Yes, he notes 3 types. Cases where the death of the person met was unknown to the NDEr at the time, cases where the death occurred at the same time or just before the NDE, and cases where the deceased person was entirely unknown to the NDEr.
And the core point here is the evidence.
Exactly. Information purportedly received or observed from these previously deceased individuals, sometimes people the NDEr didn't even know existed, or who had just died unbeknownst to anyone present, was subsequently confirmed as accurate.
How many cases like this are there?
Grayson has collected over 24 such documented examples, and other researchers have presented similar accounts.
How do they argue against these being just subjective hallucinations? Seeing dead relatives is a common trope, isn't it?
It is, but the argument here hinges on the unknown information. Since the death itself, or specific details relayed, were often unknown to the NDE, the reports can't easily be attributed to the NDEr's expectations, fantasies, or prior knowledge.
Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, the variety and specificity of the evidential reports in this category that were later confirmed make it more difficult, they argue, to attribute these observations to simple subjective states. Hallucinations don't typically provide accurate, unknown information about actual recent events or facts about the world.
Can you give some specific examples?
Sure. 3 highlighted by the scholars stand out.
Yeah.
First, cardiologist Pim Van Lommel described the case of a man who had an NDE after cardiac arrest. During it, he reported meeting his biological father who had died years earlier.
Okay.
But the NDEr had never met this man and didn't even know he was his father. He'd been raised by another man. However, later, on her deathbed, the NDEr's mother confessed this highly personal information and showed him a photograph. The NDEr accurately identified the man he met in his NDE as his actual father, confirming information he had 0 prior knowledge of.
Wow. That's powerful. What's another example?
Bruce Grayson recounted the case of Eddie, a seriously ill 9-year-old boy recovering from a high fever. Eddie immediately told people he'd been to heaven and seen his grandfather, aunt, and uncle. Standard enough, perhaps?
But there was more.
Yes. Then he added a detail that astonished and agitated his father. Eddie reported seeing his 19-year-old sister, who was away at college, and said she told him he had to return.
Why was the father agitated?
Because he had spoken to his daughter just 2 days prior. But upon calling the college, he discovered his daughter had been killed in a car accident the previous day. The college hadn't been able to reach the family yet because of Eddie's own hospitalization.
So Eddie learned of his sister's death during the NDE before his family knew.
That's the report. A third case from Grayson involved Jack, seriously ill with double pneumonia. His nurse, Anita, had left for her 21st birthday party. Soon after, Jack suffered a pulmonary arrest and had an NDE.
And
He reported seeing Anita. And Anita asked him to tell her parents she was sorry for wrecking the new red sports car they had just given her, and that she loved them.
Had she wrecked the car?
Apparently, the accident had occurred the same day as Jack's arrest, or just hours beforehand. When Jack told another nurse who happened to be friends with Anita, she ran out of the room crying, as the story of Anita's death and the accident wasn't widely known yet.
So again, verifiable information conveyed seemingly by the deceased.
Yes. And as with other categories, some reports in this category also involved cardiac arrest cases, suggesting they occurred when heart and brain activity were likely absent.
And some involved people dead for years.
Yes, some examples reportedly involved individuals who were deceased for years or even decades. These cases, according to the scholars, strengthen the argument against explanations relying solely on residual nervous system activity, or the idea that this is only a brief phenomenon at the moment of their death.
How many cases like this meeting the deceased with confirmed details are there overall?
Approximately 30 documented cases are mentioned or referred to in the sources. The scholars present these as considerably raising the evidential bar for NDE data.
It's why Grayson said they provide some of the most persuasive evidence for the ontological reality of deceased spirits.
Exactly. Evidence that spirits of the deceased exist as real entities from his perspective based on these cases.
Okay, what's the next category of corroboration?
Shared NDEs. This is where a healthy person reports sharing part or all of the NDE experience of an ill individual. Sometimes this involves medical personnel present during a crisis.
A healthy person shares the NDE. How does that work?
It sounds strange, but there are documented accounts. One compelling case from Melvin Morse involved 17-year-old Shane, who died in a traffic accident, and his 15-year-old deaf sister, Cheryl.
Okay, what happens?
Cheryl, at home some distance away, reportedly observed the entire accident process. She saw Shane flying through the air and knew he was dead. She sensed he was contacting her without words, wanting to show her something really cool. She then reported that the two of them rose in the air, high above the scene, went to heaven, and met deceased relatives. Shane, being deceased, didn't return.
That's Cheryl's report. Was there any corroboration?
Crucially, yes. Her parents, also at home, could reportedly hear Cheryl talking to Shane during this entire experience.
They heard her talking to her deceased brother while she was having this experience.
That's the report. And upon her return, Cheryl brought back information that no one else knew but was subsequently verified. Shane had told her their aunt was pregnant with a boy. No one in the family knew this at the time, but it was later confirmed.
So that case has multiple layers. Distant perception, contact with the deceased, a shared experience witnessed by healthy individuals, and verifiable unknown information.
Exactly. It's presented as a very strong compound case.
Any other examples of shared NDEs?
Raymond Moody, who coined the term NDE, described one where 5 family members were present during their mother's last moments. They simultaneously reported witnessing a bright light appear in the room.
All 5 saw it?
Yes, which multiple individual lights reportedly morphed into an entranceway. They watched their mother's spirit seemingly leave her body and enter this entryway. They all agreed it reminded them of Natural Bridge in Virginia.
What did medical staff make of that?
The hospice nurse, they told, reportedly replied that she had heard similar things and that it was not uncommon for the dying process to encompass people nearby, suggesting shared experiences might be a known phenomenon, at least anecdotally.
Interesting. Any involving medical confirmation?
There's the case of the woman with cardiac arrest we mentioned earlier, who reported many corroborated items during her apparent lack of heart-brain function. Adding another layer, her husband testified that he shared the beginning of her NDE.
He saw her leave her body.
He witnessed her immaterial self rising above her body, according to his testimony. And remember, a paramedic confirmed her accurate word-for-word recall of what they said and did physically during the event.
And researchers' personal collections.
The essay's author shared one. 2 family members in hospitals halfway across the country both reported a simultaneous NDE where they were with each other, neither knowing the other was hospitalized. They reported similar descriptions separately, which were later confirmed when they could communicate.
How many shared NDE cases are reported overall?
Perhaps not as numerous as other categories, around a dozen potential cases mentioned, but they provide a unique angle of corroboration from independent, sometimes healthy, observers.
Okay, let's go back to Susan Blackmore's other challenge, finding cases from blind persons who report seeing during an NDE.
Right. Ken Ring and Sharon Cooper took this on directly. They provided detailed reports based on interviews with 31 blind NDEs.
31. That's quite a few. Is the evidence as strong here?
The scholars acknowledge there are perhaps fewer cases, and the evidence can be harder to verify than in other categories. But they argue these cases still add significantly to the overall picture and are very difficult to explain by appealing to normal physical senses in someone blind.
Can you give examples?
Sure. Vicky, who was blind from birth, reported experiencing color images during her NDE. She met deceased blind friends and relatives and reportedly provided accurate physical descriptions of them, people she had never seen before. She also claimed to glimpse the hospital roof and described details on some jewelry.
Seeing colors and details when blind from birth. That's remarkable if true.
Another compelling case is Nancy. She became completely blind after an operation. During her subsequent NDE, she reported watching the resuscitation process from a perspective away from her body.
What did she describe?
Afterwards, she accurately described the identities of two men standing down the hallway, away from her bed, and recounted the number of staff members around her.
Was this verified?
Her medical records and testimony from one of the men were reportedly in substantial agreement, agreeing in virtually every significant respect, according to Ring and Cooper. They characterized Nancy's case as particularly strong due to the independent witness confirmation and documentation.
Any others?
Brad, blind since birth, stopped breathing for a few minutes. He reported looking down on his body, describing someone getting help, then going up through the ceiling and out of the building.
And he saw things outside.
He reported observing the rooftop, stated he could see clearly, and described the scene outside his home, including details about snow heaps from plowing and seeing a streetcar drive by. There's also Frank, a blind man who accurately described the color pattern and designs on a necktie he had received, details confirmed later in interviews.
What did Ring and Cooper conclude from their study?
After extensive discussions and verification attempts, they concluded that the blind persons in their study saw what they certainly could not possibly have seen physically. They argued they had established a putative case for factual accuracy, not just fabrication, guessing, or fantasy.
So including these cases from blind individuals, the total count from these 5 categories within the room, distance, meeting the deceased, shared, and blind NDEs is?
Well over 300 evidential NDE cases mentioned or referred to in the scholar's essay.
And there's even more evidence presented.
Yes, the scholars highlight a specific volume containing over 100 confirmed NDE reports, where each one was directly confirmed by at least one other person. That's a very strict criterion, making this collection particularly valuable for identifying strong cases.
What kinds of cases are in this volume?
It includes 14 corroborated cases from the immediate vicinity, 18 more accounts from a distance, sometimes very far away, and over 36 additional documented reports, specifically from cardiac arrest patients.
Again, emphasizing the cardiac arrest cases.
Yes, because the scholars consider them particularly impressive, as the reported perceptions occurred in states where, according to current materialist models, such perceptions should have been impossible.
What else is in that volume?
Dozens of other cases involving shared NDEs, meeting deceased loved ones, learning previously unknown information, plus these compound cases where NDEs had multiple evidential aspects, sometimes accompanied by physical healings or nonverbal messages. 66 specific accounts in this volume were not previously included in the earlier tallies mentioned.
So adding these plus other references brings the grand total to
somewhere between 300 and 400 corroborated NDE cases discussed or referred to across this whole body of work, covering a wide variety of types and subtypes.
Let's hear about some of the most evidential cases highlighted from that specific volume, the ones presented as especially challenging.
Okay. There's a cardiac arrest patient who didn't respond to resuscitation until getting a specific drug. He reported being out of my body and floating above the trauma room. From there, he peered down and saw a quarter perched on top of an 8-foot-tall medical machine below him.
A quarter? Did you know the date?
He told the physician about the quarter and that it was dated 1985. The physician reportedly got a ladder, retrieved the coin, and verified the date was exactly correct. The physician later published this account.
Using a ladder to verify, that's dedication to checking the claim. Another
cardiac arrest patient reported observing the room from above and noted a long 12-digit number printed on top of a high medical machine. Apparently, due to obsessive-compulsive disorder, she memorized the number.
And repeated it.
Yes, repeated it to the nurse and others who wrote it down. When the machine was later moved, The number was verified as the same figure the witnesses had recorded from her report. A nurse later re-verified the story, reportedly calling it one of the most incredible occurrences she had ever witnessed.
Okay, this next one sounds particularly stark. No heartbeat or brain activity for 20-25 minutes.
That's the report. During surgery, this patient correctly reported many specific details afterwards, things like an anesthesiologist rushing back into the room after leaving briefly, and a collection of post-it notes attached to the physician's monitor that had accumulated during the surgery but weren't there before.
And this was after being declared dead.
Reportedly, yes. Declared dead, body prepared for autopsy with chest already open, wife informed, before he spontaneously revived and made these accurate observations.
Is there medical testimony supporting this?
Yes. An attending cardiologist wrote about it. He stated, close to 20 minutes or more of no life, no physiologic life, no heartbeat, no blood pressure, no respiratory function whatsoever, and then he came back to life and told us what was on the video, with no cardiac pulmonary movement or brain function. But it happened, and I am a living witness. He emphasized there was no life during the reported observations.
And the surgeon.
The chief cardiac surgeon also reportedly confirmed the accuracy of the account.
Incredible. Another example.
A nurse described a woman in clinical death after a severe heart attack. The patient later reported being near the ceiling, looking down. She correctly reported several distinct incidents.
Such as?
An IV bottle accidentally smashing on the floor, watching a nurse's prize hair clip fall, get stepped on, and broken. She even identified and described the physician who broke the clip.
Details noticed from above during clinical death. What about outside the immediate room?
An incident involving a 17-year-old coma patient with a severe brain injury from a car accident. She reported an NDE where she was near the ceiling, watching her family in the hospital cafeteria.
What did she say?
She saw her father, a smoker, announce he was lighting up. Then she reported seeing both of her grandmothers join him for a smoke.
What's unusual about that?
One of the grandmothers had never smoked in her entire life and had always loudly declared she never would. Yet the patient witnessed this specific unusual incident and told her mother later, who confirmed it did happen exactly as described.
That's a very specific, unexpected detail confirmed later.
Exactly. And the scholars strongly emphasize the power of these compound cases, dozens of individual NDEs reportedly confirmed by more than one species of evidence.
Like the drowning girls with no pulse giving sequential descriptions.
Yes. Or long-distance observations from patients in cardiac arrest, sometimes with a healthy person sharing the experience. Blind NDErs with corroborated seeing. Cardiac arrest cases with accurate observed data may be perceived simultaneously by a healthy person or involving encounters with the deceased imparting verified unknown info.
The prospect of having to explain away all these combinational accounts
Seems, as the scholars put it, especially troublesome for those who deny the veridical nature of NDEs entirely.
Okay, this impressive collection of evidential cases naturally leads us to a critical question. Many NDErs feel certain they visited a heavenly realm, but can these documented evidence-based experiences actually tell us anything specific or verifiable about the nature or location of an afterlife realm, or confirm specific religious truths?
Right, and this is where that crucial distinction we made earlier becomes paramount. The scholars emphasize that almost every single one of the 300 to 400 evidential NDE cases discussed or referred to in their essay, with very few exceptions, concern confirmation pertaining to this world.
Verifiable details about the physical environment, people present, events occurring in the world the NDE left and returned to.
Precisely. And that's why the accounts of heavenly realms, however profound, beautiful, or convincing they are to the experiencer, generally don't meet the essay's criteria for evidence in the same way that seeing a specific object on the ceiling or knowing what someone said in the next room does.
Because details about the beauty of music, ineffable feelings, identifying religious figures, they're subjective.
Exactly. They lack external independent verification.
What about the cases of meeting the deceased to impart information? Isn't that otherworldly?
Well, the scholars are careful here. They acknowledge that as a potential exception, but note the evidential aspect is the confirmable content shared by the deceased, the verifiable information about this world, not necessarily the description of the heavenly environment itself where the meeting took place.
So the verifiable part is the message, not the setting.
Right. Generic comments about the environment might simply be the NDEr's interpretation or description appended to a veridical statement. To be clear, evidential reports require something external that can be checked for accuracy.
Whereas other aspects, however deeply felt, might be subjective views or reflections.
Exactly. Without the ability to check that information against external reality, how can we determine which parts, beyond the verifiable ones, are probabilistically correct or true?
But they do add a caution, right? Lack of verification doesn't automatically mean false.
Correct. Some, or even all of the unverified aspects could be true perceptions. But the challenge remains. How would we know this based on the kind of evidence being discussed in this specific debate?
So the conclusion drawn from this body of evidential cases is
That very little in NDE commentary can provide demonstrable, evidence-based information about the actual environment or other specific details pertaining to heaven or a specific afterlife location. Unverified testimony, while deeply personally significant, is presented as being closer to personal belief or interpretation than to established data when evaluated by these specific academic criteria.
And the same logic applies to negative or hellish accounts.
Yes, they could be true, but there's no demonstrable way to know based on this kind of evidence.
So subjective experiences like heavenly sights, uncorroborated meetings with family, life reviews, feelings, these are personal but rarely supported by the type of external evidence we've detailed.
That's the argument. And therefore, they cannot be used with any high degree of probability to establish specific religious doctrines or refute them.
What's the key takeaway here then, according to the scholars?
That while evidential NDEs might offer compelling support for the existence of some sort of afterlife by suggesting consciousness can function non-locally, they fail to provide evidence that helps distinguish between specific individual religious or philosophical perspectives on what that afterlife might be like.
So people from different backgrounds can look at the evidence and agree it challenges naturalism's rejection of an afterlife.
Right, the view that only natural forces operate. But NDEs don't tell us which specific religious worldview, Eastern versus Western, universalism, etc., is true. Many religious ideas are compatible with the general truth indicated by corroborated NDEs.
You mentioned a second factor besides the lack of external evidence for other worldly elements.
Yes, cultural influences and personal interpretations appear to significantly shape the description and interpretation of the heavenly aspects of NDEs, though less so the veridical content about this world. How non-human heavenly beings are identified. Specific religious messages may be added or emphasized later by the NDE. The tunnel sensation is reported as culturally specific, often absent in some Eastern contexts. Differences in reported human greeters between cultures.
Does research support this cultural influence?
Michael Sabom's research is cited. He found that religious beliefs appear to affect the interpretation of the NDE content, but not the core verifiable content itself. Faith often deepens after an NDE, but the specific direction it takes seems influenced by factors other than the NDE content itself.
What did Sabom conclude about NDEs as indicators?
He's quoted as concluding that NDEs are not indicators of who is headed for heaven and those headed for hell, nor are they accurate diagnostics of a person's specific religious beliefs or ultimate destiny.
So the consensus among researchers highlighted here seems to be
that in stark contrast to this worldly corroborated aspects, there's virtually no way to evidence the uncorroborated heavenly visions themselves. Cultural factors and personal interpretations are presented as key influences on how these subjective experiences are shaped and described.
Okay. Given the potentially paradigm-shifting implications of corroborated NDEs, it's unsurprising that there have been many attempts to explain these experiences, especially the evidential ones, through purely natural brain-based means.
Absolutely. The scholars acknowledge that some opposition to NDE data might stem partly from a prior philosophical commitment against concepts of religion, spirituality, or immortality.
And there's been a lot of academic debate on these naturalistic explanations.
Yes, many scholars have thoroughly examined a large number of proposed naturalistic explanations, and others have compiled comprehensive responses. The debate in the Journal of Near-Death Studies explored many of these arguments. The core question becomes, which position, based on the data and counter-arguments, has the most compelling case?
The central issue for the naturalistic position, according to the scholars, is,
were the recounted events genuinely witnessed during the NDE itself, or were they learned some other way through normal physical means? It's generally undisputed many reported incidents occurred during distressed states like cardiac arrest. But could all 300-plus corroborated reports be derived from information naturally acquired somehow?
maybe through minimal remaining senses just before, or overheard snippets, or learned after recovery?
Those are the kinds of alternative explanations proposed. But the scholars argue strongly against them being sufficient for the best evidence. Many of the over 150 evidential cases from inside the room seem, based on the details, to come from where the patient claimed to be outside and above their body.
Citing those specific mundane observations again, machine dials, unplugged devices, the surgeon's habit, dentures, shoelaces, jokes.
Right. Things unlikely to be the focus of attention or easily remembered through other means. Sometimes even reports shared simultaneously by healthy persons present.
So the scholars argue it would require a huge number of alternative, maybe speculative explanations to cover all these cases.
Exactly. A simply staggering array, they call it. To argue that none of these 150-plus cases from within the room were observed precisely when and how claimed, but were all pieced together naturally, maybe improbably, before or after the crisis. It stretches credulity, they suggest. The critics must explain all cases naturally. Not a single verifiable detail can be due to a real NDE if the purely naturalistic thesis holds.
They caution against substituting maybes and perhaps for observed corroborated data.
Yes, suggesting the likelihood that natural explanations can account for each and every one of these diverse cases seems highly improbable.
And they emphasize the significance of the elevated viewpoint again.
Strongly. Many observations clearly appear to have been made from the ceiling, as claimed. When corroborated information came from that upper angle, especially for items only visible from there, like the numbers on machines, that higher location must be favored as the source, they argue. It challenges explanations based on normal physical senses.
Are there control group studies relevant here?
Yes. Studies by Sabam and Sartori compared descriptions from cardiac patients who had NDEs with those resuscitated without NDEs. The non-NDE control groups made significant errors in guesses describing the scene.
Whereas the NDErs,
Their descriptions were highly accurate when corroborating evidence was available. This contrast, scholars argue, supports the idea that NDErs' observations originated during the episode from the claimed position, not from guesses or reconstructions.
What about the waking brain theory? The idea that resuscitation briefly stimulates the brain enough for normal perception?
Medical experts cited say consciousness doesn't return instantly in seconds. It typically happens after the heart restarts effectively long enough for blood flow to recover, usually past initial confusion, and crucially,
What's the crucial point?
in several of the most evidential cases, no resuscitation efforts have been administered at all before the NDE observation, or efforts have been discontinued, making this specific explanation inapplicable in those key cases. Plus, EEG activity can take hours to return, even after successful resuscitation.
And even if the waking brain theory explained some within-the-room details.
The scholars argue it fundamentally fails to account for many of the strongest categories. It doesn't explain distance cases, shared NDEs, seeing deceased with unknown info, or blind NDEs. It just doesn't address a huge chunk of the documented evidence.
Which leads to that really debated point. Observations during profound brain death, particularly during cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation.
Right, where higher brain activity ceases within 10-15 seconds, and lower brainstem activity very shortly after.
Can minimal residual lower brain activity explain NDEs?
Scholars argue no. While some minimal brainstem activity might persist for seconds longer, it's medically insufficient for high-level consciousness, the clarity, coherence, realism NDErs report, and certainly not the frequently reported confirmation of external details during this time.
And they point again to the evidence.
Forcefully. About 36 cases cited where verified data were reportedly observed after such cardiac arrests began, often well beyond the brief brain shutdown window, sometimes for prolonged minutes. And the confirmed incidents themselves often occurred precisely within these periods of documented cessation of measurable brain function.
Including those observations from above. Minute details, machine readings, conversations, clothing, exact numbers only visible from above, accurate sequences.
All reportedly observed and repeated precisely after recovery, during periods of apparent non-function. The scholars challenge the naturalistic explanation. What's the likelihood that details in every single one of these dozens of diverse cases during the flatlining interval were discovered some other way at another time, maybe by chance, yet fit perfectly into these exact time intervals? Can these alternatives be demonstrated, not just guessed?
They broaden the scope too, right?
Yeah.
Beyond the patient's brain state.
Yes. Even fully operating healthy brains still couldn't explain the 100-plus corroborative distance cases or many of the 300-plus total evidential observations. And then the examples of meeting the deceased who impart evidential information.
Information previously unknown to anyone living until reported by the NDEr.
If the explanation is a genuine encounter with the deceased, then these NDEs extend far beyond the irreversible biological death of the deceased's brain.
These cases involving the deceased seem to bypass the NDEr's own brain state entirely.
Exactly. These confirmed cases, along with others, are presented as increasing the likelihood that at least some NDE accounts report actual data from conscious states that, according to the scholars, most likely extend far beyond the death of the physical body, including the brain. So the question of whether NDEs extend during and beyond brain death seems answered affirmatively based on this evidence as presented.
So many naturalistic rejoinders rely on internal states, oxygen deprivation, seizures, drugs, dying waking brain theories, and the scholars argue this is their fundamental weakness.
Yes, their chief rub when faced with the evidential cases. Because the strength of the NDE evidence, particularly the 300-plus cases discussed, lies precisely in documenting external circumstances.
Details verified from the vicinity, events confirmed from a distance, accurate sequences, shared experiences, blind seeing, meeting deceased with evidential info, multiple types of external evidence in one NDE.
Exactly. The key argument is, if even a handful of key examples, let alone dozens, among these 300-plus external corroborated cases accurately reported data from the real-world data unknowable through normal means, then subjective theses explaining it all via internal brain states fail by a large margin to account for these key reports.
Because the NDErs themselves claim they perceived external reality.
Right. The scholars argue, no matter what subjective internal states the critics wish to discuss, by their very nature, objective, externally corroborated NDEs are unexplainable by appeals to internal states. Something objective out there reported accurately can't be refuted by explanations based on internal physiological or psychological issues they contend. This is the major problem they see with most naturalistic theories against NDEs, failure to explain the evidential external cases.
So for naturalism to work, every single one of the 300-plus corroborative accounts must be mistaken somehow. Misperception, misremembering, fabrication, coincidence.
That's the implication. And the scholars question how likely that is, given the careful scientific efforts to investigate many dozens of these specific reports. There must be no evidential remainder, they argue, if naturalism is to succeed, because the internal suppositions are absolutely trumped by the external evidential ones.
They also address shotgun explanations, like old interviews, false memories, exaggeration, lies.
Briefly, they acknowledge these might explain some data or less rigorous reports, but they argue it's highly dubious that the 300-plus carefully documented evidence cases, many collected immediately, confirmed by multiple witnesses, meticulously checked, can all be accounted for this way. These robust cases demand a more substantial explanation.
And they bring back Augustine's own earlier concession.
Yes, that the presence of these sorts of confirmed NDE data, if found, would contradict his naturalistic thesis and indicate afterlife likelihood. Blackmore and Potts made similar comments. The scholars see this as a cautionary note for those summarily closing the naturalistic door regardless of accumulating evidence. They argue the tide seems to have turned, presenting a stronger challenge than many critics acknowledge.
So their conclusion on the naturalistic position,
that it appears to occupy the far weaker position in this debate, seemingly by a long shot. Relying solely on internal explanations while dismissing or minimizing over 300 diverse external evidential cases seems highly unlikely as a comprehensive explanation. Yet, they contend this is all that remains for a purely naturalistic view. This is where naturalistic positions appear to falter, they argue.
Okay, beyond purely naturalistic explanations, what about alternative views that question NDEs as afterlife evidence but aren't necessarily brain-based? Views that might accept things like ESP or PSI.
Right. One such view is often called superpsi or living agent, LAP. The core idea here is that any evidential information gained during NDEs comes subconsciously from the minds of living persons who know the details.
So telepathy or clairvoyance from a nurse, a family member, someone nearby or far away, not from an afterlife realm.
That's the hypothesis. But it's faced significant criticism over the years. It's often described as a catch-all position.
Meaning it can be stretched to explain almost anything.
Potentially, yes. Making it seem ad hoc, proposed just for the situation, and potentially unfalsifiable. No way to prove it wrong. Philosopher C.J. Ducasse remarked, it has to be stretched very far for NDE data. H.H. Price said it requires persons to have ESP powers of almost unlimited scope, far beyond what other evidence suggests.
Are there more recent critiques?
Yes, similar concerns are echoed. Even carefully constructed academic arguments for LAP applied to NDEs are challenged. Critics argue it's stretched too thin, often lacks its own specific empirical evidence directly related to NDE situations like cardiac arrest. It's accused of special pleading, applying less rigorous standards to itself than it demands of the survival hypothesis. Even Keith Augustine reportedly commented that compelling paranormal NDE evidence would put the burden of proof on proponents of a rather ad hoc, unfalsifiable, and blanket super ESP hypothesis.
It's also charged with having a double standard, judged easier than survival cases.
That's a criticism raised, yes. Stuart Kelly states LAP views are too often challenged epistemically. How can we truly know or verify the mechanisms of such extraordinary subconscious abilities?
But even if we grant some form of LAP is real, is it seen as the best explanation for corroborated NDEs?
Many commentators and the scholars here argue it's a much less likely option than survival when evaluating these specific NDE scenarios. The best of the 300-plus evidential cases, they argue, have far more indications favoring the afterlife thesis as the source of the information.
Why? What specific NDE features argue against LAP being the sole explanation?
Well, the fact NDEs consistently occur with apparent death or minimal absent heart-brain activity. The observations reported from above the body with data requiring such angles. LAP doesn't easily explain a 12-digit figure only visible from above or surgical procedures detailed from a top-down angle.
What about the meaningless information, shoelaces, irrelevant words?
LAP also reportedly struggles there. Why would subconscious ESP retrieve such trivial details? And it doesn't easily explain unknown information being perceived, like the unplugged machine no one noticed. That info wasn't readily available in anyone's conscious mind to be picked up via ESP.
And LAP seems particularly difficult for cases involving
previously deceased persons, imparting information unknown to anyone living until reported by the deceased during the NDE. How could subconscious ESP from a living person access information held only by someone no longer living?
So while complex ESP scenarios could be supposed, the scholars argue survival is often a more direct explanation for these specific NDE features.
Yes, they argue that in the NDE arena, the afterlife scenario provides better, more direct, more specific explanations for the cumulative evidence, especially when LAP supposals don't present the same depth of confirmatory evidence or seem as adaptable to the range of phenomena. Edward Kelly is cited as holding that survival provides a stronger overall explanation, especially for evidential cardiac arrest cases and crisis apparitions.
Okay, what's the second non-natural option sometimes discussed? Impersonal survival.
Right, sometimes compared to certain interpretations in Eastern traditions like Buddhism or Hinduism, where selfhood might dissolve into a universal consciousness rather than persisting as a distinct individual.
How does NDE data relate to that view, according to the scholars?
The argument raised is that the NDE cases developed here, both evidential and subjective, consistently and strongly favor personal survival interpretations.
How so?
Heavily evidential scenarios almost always involve personal contact points, recognizing individuals in the physical world or specific deceased individuals. The continuity of selfhood is consistently reported. The same person has the NDE, observes details, reports them as a continuous whole.
And meetings with deceased family members.
Observed and recognized immediately and unquestioningly as those specific individuals. Remember the Peak and Darien cases, meeting those dead for years, recognized with intact memories, sometimes imparting verified data. NDErs' personal memories are often reported as enhanced.
Even subjective reports point towards personal survival.
Yes. Things like viewing one's body, knowing one must return for children, meetings with deceased loved ones consistently described as deeply emotional and involving joyous personal recognitions. It indicates the NDEr perceived profoundly personal interactions.
Are there philosophical problems raised for impersonal views regarding NDE data?
Yes. What confirmation or evidential report could even come from a state with no distinct self? How could losing oneself be verified or described later if one is truly unaware of oneself as distinct?
Critics might say that's just Western logic.
Perhaps, but the scholars argue the dilemma remains from an empirical reporting perspective. How do you establish viability for a truly impersonal position based on NDE reports? If evidence is remembered and claimed, distinctions are being made by persons, implying the state wasn't totally impersonal in a way that preclude individual consciousness. They also note Eastern religions don't always teach truly impersonal afterlife views anyway.
Do NDEs prove eternal life, though?
The scholars acknowledge the limits. NDEs alone can't determine the longevity of consciousness. Peak and Darien cases hint at persistence over years, but not necessarily eternity. However, they contend that truly impersonal afterlife beliefs don't seem to produce verifiable evidence approaching NDE corroboration. The claim NDE data supports purely impersonal distinctions is presented as philosophically and scientifically challenged by the reports themselves.
So, based on the NDE data characteristics, the scholars argue it seems consistently personal.
That's the strong conclusion drawn from the nature of the reports, yes.
Okay, we've really taken a deep dive into a complex and significant academic debate here. We looked at the challenges from skeptics like Keith Augustine demanding concrete, verifiable evidence.
And we unpacked a large, diverse body of documented, corroborated NDE cases cited by scholars from within the room, distance, meeting the deceased, shared experiences, cases from the blind.
Cases that proponents argue defy simple naturalistic or purely impersonal explanations.
Exactly. The scholars conclude, based on the sheer volume and nature of this evidence, that it seems sufficient to establish the evidential reality of NDEs. Documented instances of perceptions that appear to have occurred under conditions where conventional explanations seem highly improbable.
And this connects back to fundamental questions about human nature, the sense of leaving the body.
Yes. The scholars discussed how the consistent experience described by NDErs leaving the body, looking down, identifying consciousness outside, strongly aligns with and seems to support a dualist perspective. Material and immaterial aspects of the self. While other views exist, dualistic concepts are central to making sense of these reports, they argue.
And a major point emerging is that this isn't just about evidence, it's often a clash of worldviews.
Very much so. Pre-existing philosophical positions heavily influence interpretation, potentially making even strong evidence less likely to change firmly held beliefs.
The scholars critique resistance, particularly from some naturalists who seem unwilling to concede even the possibility of an afterlife or non-local consciousness.
Yes. Despite what the scholars see as significant challenges to a purely materialist worldview from this data. Ignoring corroborated NDEs or dismissive reactions don't refute the evidence, they argue. Similarly, non-naturalist options denying a personal afterlife seem less supported by the personal nature of the NDE accounts.
What do they see as the most compelling, difficult-to-explain evidence?
Those dozens of specific cardiac arrest examples, with incredible evidential corroboration of details observed after measurable cessation of heartbeat, cortical, and even lower brain activity, reports occurring precisely during this non-functioning state.
They summarize the breadth and depth again near the end.
Yes. Meticulous sequential reports, confirmed distance details, corroboration from deceased imparting unknown info, blind NDErs seeing shared cases, powerful compound cases with multiple evidence types.
The quantity and quality combined create a difficult impasse for naysayers.
That's the argument. So many alternative what-if scenarios needed for hundreds of relevant cases makes it very hard to explain everything away naturally.
They also note a trend. Fewer gains for alternative explanations recently, more medical studies allowing for possibility.
Yes, and that critics often devote little attention to the corroborative accounts, especially the best ones, despite conceding their importance earlier.
So their bottom line, based on the sources they analyze?
That competing theses, naturalistic impersonal survival, do not come close to successfully explaining the well over 300 evidential cases, especially the weightier sorts, like cardiac arrest during cessation, distance, deceased imparting info, compound cases. These pack far more punch than the alternatives.
They quote others on the cardiac arrest cases being fiercely challenged by materialists.
Yes, Rivas, Dervin, and Smith. If that domino falls evidence of consciousness without brain function, critics know their purely materialist cause is lost.
What's the final assessment from the scholars?
That major researchers looking at the cumulative NDE data rate is indicating the probable reality of consciousness persisting at least beyond initial heart-brain cessation. Naturalistic and non-naturalist responses have far less explanatory power, seem more ad hoc, perhaps driven by desire to preserve worldview commitments, often disliking spiritual religious options. The alternative views are, by far the weaker explanations, they conclude. It does not even appear to be a close comparison when the full range of robust evidential NDE data is considered.
So we've taken that deep dive into a rigorous academic debate, explored the specific demanding challenges from skeptics,
and unpacked a large body of documented, corroborated NDE cases that, according to the scholars we've discussed, present a significant challenge to simple naturalistic or impersonal explanations.
Based solely on the evidence presented and analyzed within this body of work, the scholars contend it points strongly towards consciousness being able to function independently of the physical body, at least during the near-death state.
Even when measurable heart and brain activity are absent?
It's knowledge that matters profoundly, doesn't it? It challenges fundamental assumptions many of us hold about the very nature of human existence, the mind-body relationship.
Absolutely. So the provocative closing thought for you to ponder is this. If this evidence, as presented by these researchers, is compelling, what are the ultimate implications? Not just for the perennial question of survival after death, but for our fundamental understanding of consciousness itself, right here, right now, while we are still very much alive, something for you to consider as you continue your own deep dive.